Excellent. Okay, I can't see if I'm muted. Hello, everyone. Sorry about that slight technical delay. Thank you for joining us at the Educating All Learners Alliance inaugural webinar. I am honored to participate, and today we're going to be talking about advocating for your students in the era of COVID-19. My goal is to go through the slides, take a break after each section to see if you have questions. So if you want to put questions in the chat box, that would be great, and we can check that. And then at the end, we'll have time for other questions as well. So, and for some reason, I am sorry, it is, there we go. Okay, so initially, just want to make sure everyone knows who we are and then who I am. The National Center for Special Education and Charter Schools, we are an independent nonprofit at the national level, and we help, we engage with stakeholders to ensure that students with disabilities access and thrive in charter schools, and our work has also expanded into other disability advocacy work in traditional district schools as well. And who I am, I, as you know from the description probably, am the policy director at the National Center. I am a former special education lawyer and advocate, and I see some fellow advocate friends have logged in. I helped co-create the Special Education Advocacy Center of Tennessee here in where I live in Tennessee. I'm also a former member of the Tennessee State Board of Education. I served a 5-year term there. I was former Mayor Carl Dean's education advisor here in Nashville, and my most important job is I am a mom to these lovely 2 girls, which I have personal privilege to put a picture on the screen. This is an older picture, but these are my daughters. The little one is Franny, who is now 10, and my husband's in the middle, and the one on the right is Langan, who is my 17-year-old daughter, who in the sort of edu-speak is a low incidence, high needs kiddo, and they are both amazing. So what I want to do today, what we're going to do is we're going to talk briefly about the shifting landscape that I think all of you are aware of, but just sort of where things stand there. Then we're going to talk a little bit about the ground rules, what the guidance is saying and the law. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on that because I really want to focus our time on how teachers can make it work, how you can advocate for your students. And I've divided it into connecting, assessing, and developing. And we're going to talk about doing that, advocating up to your principals, your administration, and also partnering with parents. And then, as I said, we'll take some questions on the back end. So the shifting landscape, as everyone here knows, the vast majority of public school buildings are closed. And then after that, it varies greatly depending on where you are, and sometimes within states and within districts. Some schools are completely closed, not doing anything. Some are completely online and doing full school days. Some are focusing on just the basics, making sure their students are fed, making sure the families are safe. Some schools are only doing review work. Some schools are doing new standards. Some are using online platforms. Some are using just paper. In the disability world, some schools are providing no IEP services, and some are providing everything all the way through to related services, OT, PT, speech. And then some districts are leaving these decisions at the individual school level, which means that, you know, within a district, you know, across a neighborhood, you may have 2 students who are experiencing 2 different types of education right now. So that's really sort of where we are in the landscape. And I think how you advocate for your students will depend a lot on where you are in these various places, but we're going to talk about that in more detail. I am not sure. Okay, so what are the ground rules? And I have a disclaimer here. As you saw, I'm a lawyer. This is not legal advice. If you have specific legal advice, you should ask a lawyer. But I think it'll be clear because I'm not going to spend a lot of time on the law here. It will be clear that this isn't legal advice. So obviously everyone I think on this call knows FAPE, that the IDEA, the federal law, guarantees all students with disabilities a free, appropriate public education that emphasizes special ed related services and is designed to meet their unique needs and prepare them for further education, for employment, and for independent living. You are also probably all aware that there is no pandemic exception in the law for FAPE. No one knew this was happening, so nobody prepared for it. And so what has happened is that the Department of Education, the U.S. Department of Education, has issued a ton of guidance. And these are links to the 5 pieces of guidance. There's 3 here and 2 on the next page that they issued. And so you can look at all of the different guidance in detail, but I wanted to kind of break it down. And so this is sort of the basics on the guidance. So basically, if a school is suspending all instruction for all kids, then the district is not required to provide services to students with disabilities during that time period. However, if the school reopens or, and the or here is really important, continues to provide educational opportunities to gen ed students through whatever alternative means they're using, they have to ensure equal access for students with disabilities, including the provision of FAPE. So that equal access piece is really important, and we're going to talk about that a little bit later. The guidance also is clear. This is for kids with IEPs and kids with 504 plans, that the law allows for flexibility in determining how to meet the individual needs of students. And, you know, clearly the law allowed flexibility prior to this whole pandemic occurring, but flexibility is even more important now. And so being able to figure out how to meet each student's needs looks different now. And that's what that next bullet is, that the determination of how FAPE is provided may need to be different in these times. And the guidance talks a lot about how you just need to figure out the child's access, the way the child needs to access it, and try to connect your offerings to that access. Federal law doesn't mandate specific methodologies, but again, equal access to opportunities. And then the guidance talked about meetings being conducted by alternate means, but in-person evaluations obviously have to be postponed. And the guidance goes into great detail on HIPAA and exercising discretion under HIPAA so that online platforms can be used. And tomorrow, Paul O'Neill, who's the co-founder of the center, will go into that in much more detail. So that is the guidance. And I am going to see if I can see the chat box again. I'm not sure that I can. So Lindsay, can I ask you if you see any questions that are asked?
Yes, absolutely. If anybody wants to ask questions, we're going to pause after each section. So if you just type any questions you have into the chat box at the end of each section, we'll pause and take any questions that come up.
I'm going back a second. Do we have any?
Nope, nothing for here.
Okay.
We're good.
All right, great. Then I'm going to get to the part that I really wanted to focus on today, and that's making it work and advocating for your students. So the way I've looked at it is the sort of 3 steps into making it work. And we're going to go through these. It's connecting, it's assessing, and it's then developing what you need after you do that. And so advocating up is a term that I stole from Lindsay, actually, my coworker. And you know, that's trying to get your administration and your principal to do the right thing for your students. And I think anyone who has worked in the advocacy world knows that building leadership really matters. And I have seen a lot of teachers successfully advocate up and educate their building leaders in the importance of the work that they're doing and the importance of those students, and really be able to make a difference for those kids. And so I urge you to think about how you can do that in your buildings. And so when we look at this connecting, assessing, and developing, my suggestions here when you're advocating up is obviously reach out to your school leadership. I said earlier where you are in that continuum of building closed versus a full school day virtually obviously will make a difference in where you are in these stages. But regardless, your school leadership needs to hear from you. You need to let them know how engaged you're able to be. You know, as a parent who's working full time, I understand, you know, like I'm feeling the juggling. Teachers have the same challenges that we all have. And so you need to figure out what your level of engagement, what you're able to do. And you need to, you know, just make sure your school leadership knows that. expressing your desire to engage at the level that you want to engage in and that you're able to engage in, and then letting your building leadership know the concerns you have for your families. You know the families of your students way more than your principal does, and so letting them know what your concerns are is going to be a really important foundational step to being able to advocate for their needs. The second step is assessing what systems is your school offering. If your school is offering online, synchronous live teaching or asynchronous taped teaching, where the kids can look at it later, is it accessible to the students that you were serving or were serving in the building and are still trying to serve? Are there ways that it can be made accessible? Are there other platforms that you can suggest that are more accessible for students who may need read aloud on their device, or who may need closed captioning or any of those things? So just knowing what systems are being offered, whether they match your students' needs, and if there are others that you can offer to your leadership as a suggestion, can go a long way to being able to connect your students with that equitable access that they're entitled to. And then, sometimes it takes a little bit of pushing to get the leadership to focus, especially right now. I am sure that building leaders are dealing with things that no one ever imagined they would deal with. And so persistence in making sure that your students, that the students with disabilities are also part of that conversation, I think is really important. And then finally, I would suggest developing a pitch to your leadership on the things that you think your students need, that you want to try to provide, and a plan on how to make that happen. Instead of going to your principal and saying, I have these students who are nonverbal and I don't know what to do, I don't know how to help them. Go with a plan. I have students who are nonverbal and I want to reach out to the parents and see if we can partner so that we can do things where I'm live on the other side of a screen from them and helping them instruct their student, or whatever your plan might be. Go in with that pitch so that you can not only give a problem, but give a solution to the leadership. Now, I'm going to stop there and see, Lindsay, are there any?
Okay.
If there's anything?
Yes. I'm
Excellent.
ready to throw you hard balls and curve balls. You ready?
Sweet. Yes. I'm ready.
Okay. So one question is that an attorney has a client who was to be placed in a psychological treatment school, but the Board of Ed is not meeting, and he is thus stuck at home with hardly any educational assistance. What can she do for her client?
So attorneys know I can't give legal advice, but what I would suggest for that client is that they have a conversation with whoever, if they're not placed yet, then they have a team at the school, I'm guessing. And so they need to have a conversation with that team and see what can be done in the interim until such time as they can try to figure out that placement change. Rather than, your options in my mind are, you either just say, well, we'll just have to wait, or you see or you have the power to get the Board of Ed to meet, which I doubt you have, or you figure out, is there something we can do for this student in that interim time? So that would be my suggestion.
Thanks. And Annie Acosta is asking, how many states have laws that require IEP meetings to be held in person? I know there's been some flexibility around this in the guidelines, but how does that interact with state laws that may not be, and do those laws have to be changed in order to allow for virtual IEP meetings?
It's a great question. I am not aware of states that have in-person meeting requirements for IEPs. If they do exist, which I know, Annie, if you're saying they exist, they must exist. I know, I'll give an example because I don't know a direct answer to that. The governor in Tennessee, boards and commissions were not allowed to meet remotely. Our school boards were not, and he did an executive order that allowed them to do it during this time. So that might be something to look at to see if those states, if the governors would be able to do executive orders. That's the only thing I can think of.
Yeah, thank you.
Sure.
And I know you're experiencing this one yourself right now. So there's a question about children who have really intensive support needs, who aren't able to work on a computer, and the packets aren't really helping. These are students that, generally have a big team around them in a school setting. Are there other support methods or anything that you found them to be useful in that setting? And I know just from our conversations as a team that this is something that there's not been a lot of attention around.
Right. Yeah. That is definitely a gap that I think folks are trying to fill. And yes, my oldest daughter, Langan, has a huge team at school. If there is a service, she is probably getting it in the brick and mortar building. We are in a district that is doing optional review type materials only. And so we do not, we're not in a place where the IEP services are being provided, but our teacher reaches out constantly. She is reaching out. So this is what I would recommend. And it's going to kind of get to the next piece, which is advocating with families. She is reaching out both individually to me to check in on Langan, to ask how she's doing, to offer suggestions, and then she's sending materials to the class for ideas that the class can do. Now, it's a high school group of kids where the kids are all pretty high needs, and so those materials, I mean, the kids vary, but those materials are targeted towards higher needs kids, but she's providing things and then reaching out to us after. So I would encourage folks who are on the parent side of that to reach out to your teachers. We also had our service providers, our speech therapist, occupational therapist, vision therapist, physical therapist, all reach out individually by email and say, thinking about your child, let me know any way that I can help. And so again, they're not providing their actual services on the IEP. The district just made clear compensatory will come in, but they're reaching out. And so I'm able to connect with them and say, hey, here's some of the things I want to work on. What are your ideas? And we're collaborating that way.
Great, thanks. And I think there's other questions that are more on the parent side of things. So I'm going to let you continue your next section, and then we can maybe loop back to some of those.
Awesome. So the partnering with parents piece, again, connecting, assessing, and developing. And I divided this into two categories. So first is outreach. And hopefully a lot of this has been done, but in the midst of all of this and with different states doing things at different times that may not have been, reaching out to the families and expressing concern and commitment is, I cannot stress enough how much of a difference that will make. I mean, I've experienced it, as I said, from the family side, and you don't have to reach out as an educator and say, hey, I'm concerned, I'm committed, and here are all the things I'm going to do to solve all these problems. You can let the family know you don't have all the answers, but you want to work together to come up with answers to get everyone through this time. I suggest you clearly explain what the school's plan is for this period with every district. And, you know, again, sometimes within districts, people like different expectations, different plans. It is really confusing on the parent side to even know what the rule book is for their school. And so clearly explaining, here is what we are doing as a school or as a district, if it's a district-wide decision, and we'll continue to update you as that changes, because a lot of districts early on didn't really fully comprehend how long this was going to be. And so they initially were just like, we're closing. And then districts have slowly started to rethink their processes. And so just let the families know, like, this is where we are now, and I'm going to let you know when that changes. That will make a world of difference. And then you have to assess what their needs are. What are their technology needs? What are their access needs? You know, do they have devices? Do they have Wi-Fi? Do they have, if a child who can't use a computer, do they have access to a device that they can use to support their learning? If they use a device at school, how can they get that? If it's a school that's doing packets and the students can learn from the packets, do the families have a way to get to the packets? Do they have a way to pick them up? Or, you know, all of that is really critical. You can't, obviously, if you can't connect the materials to the family can't do anything. And then what supports do they need to be able to engage? Do they, you know, some schools are providing food, but, you know, families may need that. They may just need you to call and check in on them. It could be a pretty lonely situation depending on the family dynamics. And so just figuring out what those supports are and thinking outside of just the typical school box into what all the different types of supports the families may need. And you may not be able to provide any of these things. Ideally, your school can provide the technology or the access and some supports, but if you don't know what they need, you're not going to be able to move on to the next step. And so that's really important. And then developing trust. You know, I think every educator or parent or advocate on this call knows that trust can be sometimes a challenge in the special ed world. But when it happens, and I know I speak this from experience, it is a really strong bond. And this is an opportunity for that to happen, to build trust with families. Frequent check-in calls or emails make an incredible difference. For both my child in gen ed and my child in who has a disability, hearing from the teachers frequently when they're just saying, hey, how's it going? How's she feeling? You know, I'm happy to hop on the phone with her if she needs to hear my voice. That sort of stuff really makes a big difference. And so I would recommend all that. And then the collaboration piece. Once you have built that outreach foundation, you can collaborate with the family. So express a desire to work together with them and let them know what the process is going to be. If your school is moving forward with, you know, full school access, here's what we're going to do to figure out how to implement the IEP that's in place, or how to figure out what we need to put in place in this unusual circumstance. If a lot of what's in the IEP, we can't figure out a way to do it, outside of a school building or outside of, you know, physical contact. And then what is the family's capacity to partner? Who's going to work with the child in the home? Is this a child who can work independently? Or is this a child who's going to need someone really hands-on? In my house, both my 10-year-old who's typically developing and my 17-year-old with high needs need me to be very hands-on. And so knowing who in the home can do it and what their availability and ability to do that is critical to being able to figure out what it's going to look like. And then how hands-on are they going to need to be, and what supports can you provide to help them succeed? You know, if you have a parent who's working full-time and a student who really needs hands-on support, is there a way, if that parent's hours are flexible, is there a way to carve out a certain amount of time during the day for that student's time for you to be engaging with them and the parent to be able to help them implement the IEP? But just trying to figure out what those supports look like to be able to help that parent do, you know, on the back end, on the home end of things, what needs to be done is really important. And then you need to develop a plan of action for what it looks like with the family and the rest of the IEP team. And I think that is really important. Family members, as everyone on this call knows, are equal members of the IEP team. In the IDEA, they're actually listed as first in the list of membership. And in these times, particularly for both trust and for implementation, they really have to be a part of creating that plan. So is it an amended IEP? Is it a written agreement that is specific to COVID-19? And the guidance talks about how you can have these sort of contingency plans that you can build for these purposes. Whatever it is, you want to create that with the family and then make sure the family has an accessible copy. Obviously, in a physical IEP meeting, you know, they either get the draft to bring home to decide whether to sign, or they sign it and get a copy, they're handed a copy. And so making sure that you're thinking through how to give them an accessible copy in this virtual world is really important as well. And then the one thing before we take questions, this is really the end of the presentation piece, but one of the things I've been thinking a lot about is the silver lining here. And, you know, in the special ed world, parents usually have little access, like a little insight into what's actually like the relationship and the work that you're doing with their children, right? So they drop them off at the school door, they get progress reports, they talk to you, obviously, they're at the IEP meetings, they can observe if they want to, but this is an opportunity for parents really to see up close what, you know, the big difference that you're making in their student's life, how committed you are, and how wonderful you're doing, you know, what you're doing to support their child. And so I think it's a real opportunity to develop partnerships with families. The opposite of that is for districts or schools that are really trying hard not to serve kids with disabilities during all of this, that's going to cause a much bigger divide. And you know, the distrust there is going to be real distrust. And so I'm encouraging, you wouldn't be on this call if you didn't want these true partnerships. So I'm encouraging you to do what you can to reach out and partner with families. And that is, other than, if I could get back on, there we go. Questions.
Thanks, Wendy. We've had several questions just about kind of access, technical needs, language barriers, things like that, which I think are really covered in this kind of framework that you talk about with connecting, assessing, and developing. And I think kind of doing that connection piece first is really critical, and then assessing what those needs are. And those are going to vary from parents' availability, language barriers, technical access, all of that kind of stuff. But I think that's a helpful framework to think about that in. There's been a late breaking question here that I think is maybe helpful to touch on. And I know that we are probably, this will be the last question that we have time for. Okay. So someone's asking, basically, are we going to have to do blanket revision of all IEPs for placement? What do you think? And I think this is kind of that long-term thinking we've started to talk about kind of as we're coming back into school, likely in the fall, you know, what's going to be that reassessment that needs to happen at that point with IEPs?
I think those are two questions. One is whether you have to revise all the IEPs because of this placement change, like they're now in a different setting than they were. And I think there's a split of legal conversation about that. Some folks are saying you do because it's a new setting for the student. Some are saying that you don't because all students are in this new setting. And so it's not a new placement. It's not a more restrictive environment. So I don't know the answer to that. What I would suggest is that you have those conversations with families. You're going to be amending or, you know, creating plans to move forward regardless, and try to include in those plans exactly what's happening and what the, you know, what the location is.
I think that was the question.
Okay.
All right. I think that we promised to get you out of here by 3:30. There are many, many other questions in the chat box. I did pop in an FAQ. We've had several webinars that we've hosted and answered a lot of the questions that are there in an FAQ that I put into the chat box. We are going to be sending around these slides and a recording of this webinar, and we have more to come tomorrow. So if your question didn't get answered today, please check back with us. And there's also a way in the website to submit, you know, if there's a couple of questions asking for specific resources or forms, and pop them into the website as a way to kind of highlight those things, because we're really interested in being responsive to what your needs and requests are.
And Lindsay, will the deck be available on the website as well? Because it has the links to all the guidance, and then it has our contact information as well.
The deck we're going to send out to everybody who registered for this webinar. The recording will be available, but all of the guidance docs are already in the resources page. So if anybody needs those, they are already linked in the resources page on educatingalllearners.org.
Okay, great.
Thank you so much, Wendy.